almost $1 trillion on the table. It was presented as proof that Washington could bend its allies' wallets to America's will. A combined pledge larger than the GDP of some nations, framed as a down payment on U.S. economic revival. But the shine has worn off. The two countries behind the pledges, South Korea and Japan, are now signaling that the terms, as described by President Donald Trump, are not just unworkable, they may be impossible. The clash has left one ally warning that cash demands could destabilize its economy, while another is openly floating renegotiation. For Washington, what was meant to be a triumph is now becoming a test of alliance trust in Asia. To really understand why this fight matters, it helps to step back and look at the sheer scale of trade between these economies and the United States. Start with Japan. In 2024, trade in goods and services between the U.S. and Japan was worth roughly $319 billion. Goods made up the lion's share, about $227 billion. That left Washington with a goods trade deficit of nearly $70 billion. Of that, the U.S. exported $79 billion worth of products to Japan while importing around $148 billion back. That left Washington with a goods trade deficit of nearly $70 billion, a gap that has long been a point of tension for Tokyo. That surplus, often tallied at about $63 billion, is a sign of its economic heft, but also a reminder that it can be a target for political pressure. Now shift to South Korea. The numbers aren't quite as large, but they are still massive. In 2024, total trade in goods and services between the two countries came to nearly $240 billion. Goods alone accounted for about $197 billion. The U.S. exported roughly $66 billion and imported about $132 billion. That left another sizable goods deficit around $66 billion. Services trade told a different story. The U.S. exported $27 billion in services to Korea and imported $15.5 billion, leaving Washington with a surplus of more than $11 billion. That left another sizable goods deficit around $66 billion. Around $66 billion. Services trade told a different story. The U.S. exported $27 billion in services to Korea and imported $15.5 billion, leaving Washington with a surplus of more than $11 billion. And here's the hook. When you put these numbers side by side, hundreds of billions flowing back and forth each year, Washington's demand for $350 billion in upfront cash from Seoul begins to look extraordinary. It's larger than the entire U.S. export market to Korea, larger than the total value of services trade between the two countries, and so big that it would swallow more than 4/5 of Korea's foreign reserves in one gulp. That explains why Seoul's pushback has been so sharp. National Security Advisor Wi Sung-glatz
didn't hedge when he went on national television. He said flatly that South Korea could
not pay $350 billion in cash. His words were clear. It is objectively and realistically not a level we are able to handle. Prime Minister Kim Minsk doubled down, warning that unless Washington provided a dollar swap line to protect liquidity, the package could deliver a severe blow to the national economy. The deals were announced in the summer. South Korea agreed to a $350 billion investment pledge in July. Japan followed with a $550 billion vehicle in September. In return, the United States promised to cut tariffs, lowering rates from 25% to 15% for both allies' exports. The headline numbers dazzled. Trump himself called the pledges upfront money, a direct infusion of capital into U.S. projects. He described the agreements as victories that proved America could command resources from abroad. But even then, the details were murky, and within weeks, cracks appeared. The first cracks came from Seoul. Over the weekend, National Security Advisor Wi Sung-glatz told Channel A News that South Korea simply could not provide $350 billion in cash. It is objectively and realistically not a level we are able to handle. He said our position is not a negotiating tactic. That blunt assessment cut through the THEU gave Washington the right to select projects in strategic sectors, semiconductors, critical minerals, energy, and pharmaceuticals. Once selected, Japan would have 45 business days to provide funds. Both institutions are bound by law to ensure their activities benefit Japan. Funding must be structured in line with existing rules, primarily as loans, guarantees, and limited equity stakes. The timeline also matters. THEU stipulates that projects will be funded from time to time until January 2029. In practice, this means Japan's commitment is a ceiling, not a lump sum. On Sunday, Sai Takai, a leading contender to lead the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, warned that Japan must defend its interests. Yet, even this carefully designed structure is now facing political scrutiny. Country's ability to defend its currency. Economists noted that such a transfer could weaken the won, trigger capital flight, and leave South Korea vulnerable in a crisis. Prime Minister Kim Min-chok echoed those concerns in an interview with Bloomberg News. Without a dollar swap arrangement with the United States, he said the package could deliver a severe blow to the if anything unfair that is not in Japan's interest comes to light in the process of implementing the deal, we must stand our ground, she said. That includes a potential renegotiation. Her statement came just days before the LDP's leadership vote on October 4th. Alongside Agriculture Minister Shinjiro Kasumi, she is one of two front-runners to succeed the current leadership. The outcome of the vote will likely determine Japan's next prime minister, and with it the country's stance toward the U.S. deal. For Washington, that creates fresh uncertainty. What looked like a signed victory could now be reopened by domestic politics in Tokyo. Meanwhile, Washington's messaging has not shifted. Trump continues to describe both pledges as upfront cash. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has reportedly told Seoul that Washington prefers cash rather than loans. The White House's political need for large, simple numbers appears to be driving its hard line, but allies see danger in those numbers. In Seoul, officials argue that draining reserves could endanger financial stability. In Tokyo, negotiators stress that JBIC and NEXI cannot legally fund projects without clear benefit for Japan. In both capitals, policymakers are determined not to bankroll U.S. political headlines at the cost of national security. The markets have taken notice. In South Korea, the won has weakened amid uncertainty. Analysts warn that if reserves are tapped too aggressively, investor confidence could erode. In Japan, the risk is less immediate, but no less real. If JBIC and NEXI are forced to support projects that lack domestic value, their credibility could suffer, and political backlash could grow. For American companies, the costs are also tangible. Tariff reductions were tied to expectations of capital flowing into U.S. projects. Firms in semiconductors, energy, and infrastructure anticipated new funding. Instead, projects remain in limbo, caught between Washington's demands and allies' resistance. The broader strategic context cannot be ignored. Washington framed these deals as part of its Indo-Pacific strategy, a way to cement alliances while countering China's influence. By tying tariff relief to massive investment pledges, Trump hoped to both strengthen U.S. industry and bind allies closer. Yet, the approach risks backfiring. Instead of unity, it has generated friction. Both Seoul and Tokyo rely heavily on the U.S. alliance for security, but both are now signaling they will not jeopardize economic stability for political theater. Analysts warned that pushing too hard could undermine trust at a moment when Washington most needs cohesion. The calendar only adds pressure. On October 4th, Japan will choose its new leader, a decision that could recalibrate the country's stance. Later in the month, Trump is expected to meet both leaders at the APEC summit in Gwangju. Officials in Seoul hope the summit will deliver progress, perhaps with Washington softening its demand for upfront cash. In Tokyo, much will depend on whether a new prime minister decides to honor the deal as written or push for revisions. Until then, the gulf remains wide. Trump claims victory, portraying the deals as proof of his leverage. South Korea insists the cash terms are impossible. Japan stresses that its commitments are structured and conditional. The chasm between rhetoric and reality is growing by the day. What began as a promise of industrial revival has become a test of diplomacy. On one side is a U.S. administration hungry for headline numbers. On the other, are allies unwilling to compromise financial security. The outcome will decide more than tariffs and investments. It will shape trust, stability, and the future of America's alliances in Asia. The promises were vast. The pushback is fierce. And the final chapter has yet to be written. The story ends here, but my request begins. This channel has no sponsors, no safety net. It survives only because of you. If you believe truth should never be for sale, then help keep it alive. Subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every click is a signal that independent voices matter, that truth matters. And together, it's the only way this channel grows and the only way truth survives.